This is a recording that will try to catch up on our class that we missed. Since we fell a little behind on Kant, we spent more time than I was anticipating. The topic of Kant on disobedience, we never got around to it. So this is a recording trying to catch up on that before your exam next week. It's a bit of an experiment. It's the first time I'm doing this, so we'll see how it goes. It'll probably be a little shorter. I was anticipating that this is going to be a shorter class than normal classes, and there won't be any discussion now, so that might be good. Anyway, we'll get going. So I'm going to go flip through the presentation as if you'd see it in class and talk over it. That's the strategy. So in the previous classes, the ones that we discussed in the classroom, we went through these three steps in Kant's argument. Right? So we saw that for Kant, justice cannot obtain in a state of nature because right is not possible. Conceptually, it can and it actually must obtain in a state because there the wills of all are tied together in this omnilateral will that guarantees justice. And then it follows, he says, and we talked about that towards the end of Thursday's class, that people can actually be forced into the state. The next step, and that's the final step really to complete sort of the overview of Kant's political philosophy, is not only can people be forced into the state, once they're in there, there is no justice in disobeying the law. So it's impossible, he thinks, again, as with Kant, for all things, this is a conceptual matter. You cannot rightfully disobey the law. The first step for Kant has to do with the kind of rightful condition that the state offers, promises to people. Like we said many, many times, there is no right in the state of nature, and the right is guaranteed in the state or in the civil condition. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, one thing obviously is that that morally speaking, life in the state is very, very attractive. But more specifically, he thinks there's a kind of freedom and equality that the state guarantees. So freedom in the sense of external freedom for Kant, there's a variety of senses of freedom you could imagine that might be relevant to Kant. Kant in his moral philosophy has a lot to say about autonomy as necessary to a free life. But that's not the sense of freedom that matters for political philosophy from the point of view of what the state's business is. From the point of view of what the state's business is, the type of freedom that matters is external freedom, and that means sort of the protected right or freedom, ability to choose without interference or constraining by the wills of others. So if you remember, the state's business is to ensure that everybody has the ability to live by their own free wills and to give everybody the space for that. That's what it is, to live under a universal law protecting external freedom. And so he says under positive law, when we have an omnilateral will, not just your unilateral will, but an omnilateral will that guarantees for everyone a separate sphere of freedom in that sense, everyone is guaranteed to be free. And that's not just such a thing that would obtain if we were lucky or if the state functions well. That's a matter of what the law is and what the state is. So pretty good. Second thing that's pretty good, everyone is equal, he says. Right? So no one can obligate anyone else more than they can bind them in return. If you remember, this is the problem in the state of nature, right? Like you cannot appropriate external objects like tables, chairs, pieces of land, what have you not, any type of object, right? Because your unilateral will cannot bind others. For the reason that your unilateral will binding others would express a type of superiority of your will over theirs. That you unilaterally get to decide what morality demands of them, what rights and obligations they have, and that's inconsistent with the type of equality that we have. Remember, this equality is a theme that runs common through all social contract theorists. Right? Hobbes talks about the rough natural equality of human beings in the state of nature. Locke talks about equality meaning that people can't take away each other's natural freedom, and we see the same here in Kant. Right? So if in a state of nature there can't be any rights or external rights, because it would mean, for those rights to be created, it would mean that one person's will could bind others. In the state, we can be equal and have rights at the same time, so we can be free and equal. Because we can be free under the law gives us these rights, but the law is not just an expression of your unilateral will or my unilateral will. We are all symmetrically positioned with respect to the law. We are symmetrically equal before the law. And in the sense that we're equal before the law binds us, but it's not nobody's will that is binding us. It's sort of equally reflecting and binding of us all. And that's, there you have it, right? That's a good thing, Kant thinks. Finally, everyone is independent. And what that means is it's not quite the same as being free, although it's a part of being free. For Kant, independence means just that the absence of having to depend on others for your freedom. So freedom means, in one sense at least, the absence of being constrained by the wills of others. Independence is the thing that you get when you have a kind of protection of your freedom. The protection that you get when your freedom and your equality do not depend on just others being sort of well disposed enough to respect your freedom and equality, but a kind of guaranteed protection of that freedom and equality. Of course, if others being well disposed enough to respect your freedom and equality was enough, then we can have that in the state of nature. Right? In civil society, it's a different matter. What we have there is something better because we don't have to hope that others are going to be nice to us. We have a guaranteed freedom and a guaranteed equality through the enforced law, the enforced omnilateral will. So for Kant, these are three crucial moral features that the state gives us, that life in civil society gives us, and they're not possible in the state of nature. Now I'm rehearsing this because it's a key part of why Kant thinks that disobedience to the law is not rightfully possible. You cannot with justice disobey the law, because the kind of things that we're seeing here are things that you only get under the law. And we'll get back to that. So, for Kant, to achieve freedom, equality, and independence, the state has to have three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. This is also a standard theme in social contract theory. We've seen Ripstein, if you've read Ripstein, and by now you should have. If you've read Ripstein, you've seen that Ripstein gives arguments for why each of these branches matter. Oh, excuse me. Jeez. All right. The explanation he gives is quite elegant. Ripstein says that the legislature unites the wills of all, the executive is the the enforcing body or organ of the state, and the judiciary applies general rules to concrete instances. And he draws an analogy with practical reason in cases of inference. Last class, I put on the board a version of this argument. The idea being that the rule of inference by which you complete an argument, by which the conclusion follows from the premises, cannot itself be among the premises of the argument. It has to be presupposed for the argument to go through. Ripstein has a nice, elegant argument about why the judiciary is required, because the legislature only can come up with general principles of right, general rules of what is right and wrong. But they have to be applied to particular cases. And when you do that, when you have to apply the general rule to the particular case, it cannot be done by the rule itself. It has to be applied by something outside of the rule, and that would be then, in this case, the judiciary. Ripstein is reading a little bit into Kant. It's a very nice and elegant and interesting reconstruction of what Kant is doing, and it might be what's buried inside of the text of Kant, or the logic of the argument. Insofar as we look just dryly at what the text gives us, the text doesn't quite say that. The text Kant only says that the three branches of government are like the parts of a practical syllogism. So he does talk about these type of inferences, but he seems to refer to the major premise and the minor premise of a practical syllogism as corresponding to branches of government and a conclusion corresponding to the judiciary. Then, so I don't know exactly what to make of that argument. See what you make of it yourself. In any case, once these three branches of government are in place, you get these three super nice benefits, right? You get these moral goodies: freedom guaranteed, equality guaranteed, and when our freedom and equality is guaranteed, we enjoy a type of independence, none of which is really possible in the state of nature. It's only possible under law. Now, when Kant talks about obedience to the law and why he thinks it's always wrong to disobey the law, it's important to keep in mind what he thinks the problem of the state of nature is. The problem of the state of nature is that we're judges in our own case, not just in the sense that Locke talks about it. So it's not just that when somebody does wrong, all we have in a state of nature is you yourself being judge, jury, and executioner, and this is sort of dangerous, or you're easily biased, and so on. No, in a more fundamental way, we're judges in our own case. We're judges about morality in our own case. So we get to decide ourselves only what is right and wrong, and we try, ultimately, when we have to live on shared terms with others, we have to live on the same rules, ask them to respect our rights, we have to impose our view of justice on others, and so vice versa, right? They do the same to us. And this is the problem because we only have a bunch of unilateral wills clashing and potentially conflicting, and that's not justice, he says. Now the solution is, of course, the state with the enforced omnilateral will. We've seen that tons of times by now. But to do that, the state has to have genuine authority. Right? The omnilateral will, whatever that thing is, right? But all of our wills combined in the state, something that comes down to us through the law, the positive law. That has to be something that then takes precedence over our own individual wills, our unilateral wills. If it didn't, then we would be back in the state of nature. The state of nature is where we act on our unilateral wills. If we're leaving that behind, that means we have to replace our unilateral wills with something else. This is the omnilateral will. So basically, just you have to respect the authority of the law and the state. You have to obey the law. This is just what it means to switch from the state of nature into civil society. All right. That's the background. Here, consider then the following argument. First, a party's judgment, so somebody's judgment about morality, is authoritative if and only if no one has valid grounds for objecting to it. I'm shortening this here, as always, leaving certain qualifications and clarifications outside. When we see that no one has valid grounds for objecting to it, we're talking primarily here about the people who are subject to it. Right? Someone is authoritative vis-a-vis or with respect to another person. So you have authority over me if your judgment about morality is something that I have no grounds of objecting to. I can't resist it with justice. Second, an omnilateral will expresses the rational wills of all citizens. That's just the definition of the omnilateral will for Kant. Right? So those who are united in it, being the citizens, all their wills are captured in, or united in the omnilateral will, which then expresses that. Now, if something expresses your rational will, third, then you can have no valid grounds for objecting to it. The idea being, if you're really sort of rationally committed to something, then since the only valid objection you could have would be one that you could rationally endorse, at least on Kant's view, the fact that it expresses your rational will removes the grounds for objecting. The only grounds you could have for objecting to it would be not rational or irrational, and those are not grounds we have a lot of reason to take very seriously. So, 1, 2, 3. Then 4, the intermediate conclusion, therefore the judgment of an omnilateral will about morality is authoritative for all the citizens. Those are all the people subject to it. They can't have any reason to object to it because all their wills are united in it. So when the omnilateral will, the judgment, basically what the law says, when that comes down, it unites your will. or at least the rational part of your will. 5, if a judgment is authoritative, so if we have that thing, if we have that authoritative thing, then it ought to be obeyed by all those who are subject to it. If you don't have any valid reason for objecting to it, then you should follow it. That's the argument here. That's what it means for something to be authoritative. It means that you should follow it. When you're in the military and your commanding officer gives you an order, the commanding officer has authority over you, which means that you, when you receive that order, you don't have valid grounds for objecting to it within certain limits. But most of the time you don't have any valid grounds because an order is an order. And then because you got the order, you ought to obey. You ought to perform the order. That's in the case of the military. We're not talking in the case of the citizens and the law, but the logic of the situation is very similar. So if a judgment is authoritative, it ought to be obeyed, and so therefore it follows that citizens ought to obey the law. That's kind of the argument that you get in Kant for why, or it's buried at least in Kant, in the background in Kant, for why citizens ought to obey the law. It's because the law is expresses the rational demands of justice, and when facing the rational demands of justice as someone whose will is tied up into the law, you are already rationally committed to following the law. The law is in some sense just your own will. And again, this is a theme that we've seen time and again in social contract theory, right? Like how do we make consistent the fact that the state is trying to exercise authority over us on the one hand, with, on the other hand, the idea that we're all sort of morally equal in the sense that nobody has a natural authority over anyone else. And the answer, in one way, shape, or form, always is, well, you, the citizen, are self-imposing this law. You're choosing this law. In Locke, the clearest, most straightforward version is you consented. By consenting to the authority, you are imposing it on yourself. In Kant, it's a slightly less straightforward story, but still the same story after all. And the story is not you consented, but you rationally will what the law tells you to do. Alright, if that's true, then it follows then at the bottom of the page that the law provides the authoritative determination of justice. So it tells you something about what justice is. It has a judgment that is, to be sure, fallible. It can get it right or wrong. But it doesn't really matter whether it gets it right or wrong because it's authoritative. You are committed to obeying it by the argument above. So, compare Kant and Hobbes. Kant and Hobbes disagree theoretically, clearly. We've seen they both think that the state of nature is unacceptable, but they think this is for very different reasons. Hobbes thinks it's unacceptable in the sense of really, 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 really bad option. Prudentially unacceptable. Any person with any sense will try very hard to avoid it because it's just such a bad deal. Kant thinks not just that the state of nature ought to be avoided because it's a bad deal, although it could be a bad deal, but he thinks it even ought to be avoided if it wasn't a bad deal, because you're by reason in this thicker sense, this more Kantian moral sense of reason, the sense of reason that gives you right and all the practical requirements and so on. By that sense of reason, you're required to leave it behind. And so even if it turned out to be nice and cuddly, the state of nature, you still should leave it behind. So theoretically, big difference, but practically, in terms of how they see the problem, state of nature, unacceptable, they agree. And how they see the solution, the state being the thing that gives you the authoritative determination of justice and something you cannot question, they also agree. So for both, it's not just that you have an obligation to obey the law that has limits, as in Locke, or that might be defeasible or weak in the sense that if you think, well, the content is really, really bad, so that the really bad nature of the content of the law overrides my obligation to obey the law or something. None of that is true for Kant or Hobbes. They think this obligation to obey. You ought to obey the law as a citizen, pretty much absolutely. With Kant, it seems to be absolute. With Hobbes, you remember there is this one exception of it's absolute except if the state tries to kill you. Anyway, back to Kant. Here's how Kant puts it, listing a number of quotes just to direct your attention in the reading to where he's making these claims. Section 46. The legislative authority can belong only to the united will of the people, for since all right is to proceed from it, it cannot, he emphasizes cannot, it cannot do anyone wrong by its law. This summarizes the argument we saw on the previous slide, right? The legislative authority can belong only to the united will of the people. So if you have a legislative authority, it is the united will of everybody, including you. Right? And all right depends on this united will conceptually, because it cannot depend on a unilateral will, it must depend on this united will. But then we have right, and right being the opposite of wrong, right? The right cannot be wrong at the same time, and so the legislative authority delivers right, and so the legislative authority cannot do any wrong by its law. Since a people must be regarded as already united under a legislative will in order to judge with frightful force about the supreme authority, it cannot and may not judge otherwise than as the present head of state wills it to do. Cannot and may not judge otherwise. The fact that Kant says cannot here, not just may not, but cannot, is significant. The people is already united under a general will through the legislature. Remember what this means? It means you're rationally committed to do what the law says. If you're already rationally committed, and the only part that really matters inside your head, so to speak, is the rational part, then you have no space left inside your head, so to speak, to judge otherwise than what the law says. The law says do X. That means, by Kant's argument, that you are rationally committed to X. If you now want to say not X, something else, well, you're doing something else then, being a reasonable, rational person. And since your actions really only have moral worth insofar as they derive from reason and rationality, Kant thinks it's just impossible for you to judge in any significant way. Right? You might, of course, want to do something else. You might be tempted to do something else. Your weakness of will might push you to do something else. But you cannot judge reasonably or rationally to do something else. Here is another version of the same point. If a subject wanted to resist this authority, he would be punished, got rid of, or expelled as an outlaw, ex lex, in accordance with the laws of this authority. That is, with every right. In accordance with the laws of authority, that is, with every right, by definition again, right? Like in virtue of the first quote that we have here on the page. I asked in one of the reading questions for you to think about why Kant calls people outlaws here. The answer, at least I think so, is Kant calls people an outlaw. That's a significant phrase for him because by disobeying, you are putting yourself outside of the lawful condition. You are second guessing the law, but you're supposed to be, if you're going to be free, equal, independent, inside the law, governed by law. And so anyone who wants to resist puts himself outside of the law, and that's really back into the state of nature. And if you remember, we can be forced out of the state of nature. The state of nature is a situation of the highest injustice, devoid of justice, and so punishment is perfectly appropriate, Kant thinks. Any type of disobedience, therefore, can be punished. You can be expelled, thrown out of society, because you've already put yourself outside of society. Got rid of, no less. The sovereign has only rights against his subjects and no duties that he can be coerced to fulfill. Coerced, I'm adding that, right? He says, I'll get back to that. Moreover, even if he goes against the law of equality in assigning the burdens of the state in matter of taxation, recruiting, and so forth, subjects may indeed oppose this injustice by complaints, but not by resistance. So I've bolded coerced and injustice. And the reason I've done this is, notice that what Kant is saying, he is emphasizing when he says the sovereign has only rights but no duties. He says the sovereign cannot be held to account in the sense of right that we're talking about here. The sense of right we're talking about here is the business of the state. It's the sense of right that's relevant for political philosophy, and that's the stuff that has to do with coercion and force. Remember that was how it began with Kant. That's how it defines right. Right insofar as it has an obligation attached to it that can be enforced. Now, that doesn't exhaust all of morality for Kant, obviously. There are all sorts of duties that are out there that are real and that are not enforceable. You have duties to give to charity, Kant thinks famously, that cannot be coerced. You get to choose when, where, to whom you give. You get to choose how much you give, but you must give. But because you get to choose, nobody can force you to do it at a specific time, at a specific location, at a specific amount, and so on. You have duties to yourself. There might be duties to cultivate certain characteristics, and so there might be all sorts of duties. And the sovereign, the head of state, the president, right, the king, whoever it might be, surely has those duties because it's still a human being. Kant's only point here is that when we think about using this apparatus of the state, when we're using police, courts, the law, that cannot be applied to the sovereign because the sovereign is the head of it. And if you think about this sort of as a pyramid, right, so it goes upwards to the very top, where at the bottom, the base of the pyramid is the people, subject to your police officers and so on, and the courts, appeals courts, and the Supreme Court maybe, and then you have the sovereign at the top. That's just it gets narrower and narrower. There are fewer and fewer places to go. To all the way at the end, you have the sovereign, and then the sovereign is subject to no one. The sovereign is where it begins. Well, if the sovereign is subject to no one, sovereign is where the law originates from, and he cannot be subject to coercible or enforceable duties. So even if he goes against the law of equality, right? So Kant is accepting here, look, there's actually moral requirements in how the sovereign, how the state assigns the burdens of the state. Should be doing it equally. Kant thinks people should be taxed equally. Even if they don't, even if they start picking on some group over the other. Blacks over whites, men over women, rich over poor, whatever. That would be wrong, Kant thinks, because remember, everyone has to be equal before the law, and that means sort of blind equal treatment. But even if that is wrong, and even if they are doing it, you might complain about it, you might go to the courts, you might petition, you might write letters, you might do all sorts of stuff, but you can never resist. And we've seen this is very similar to Hobbes. Right? It is an injustice, by the way. Right? It is an injustice. So remember, Kant has these two levels of morality. It's the injustice in one sense and injustice in the other sense. In one sense meaning just a pure reason, rational sense. The other sense being injustice in the sense of enforceable, and a state of nature can have injustice in the pure rational sense, but not in the enforceable sense. And so the state has justice in the enforceable sense necessarily, but that doesn't mean it necessarily also has justice in the rational sense. It just means that you as a subject don't get to resist if you think the two are coming apart. Here's a long one. The reason a people has a duty to put up with even what is held to be an unbearable abuse of supreme authority. So Kant says this is all the way to what you think might be the very worst. Right? Even an unbearable abuse you have a duty to put up with. The reason is that its resistance, the people's resistance to the highest legislation, can never be regarded as other than contrary to law. That's by definition. Right? You're going against the law. And indeed, as abolishing the entire legal constitution. Sounds like hyperbole to you, probably. Kind of sounds like hyperbole to me, but what Kant is trying to point out is the legal constitution, the whole idea about the state, depends on all of us being equally subject to the law. And now you, as a disobeyer, right, somebody who resists the law, you are putting yourself outside of the law, and that destroys the whole thing. For the whole thing to work, we have to be equally subject to the law, and you are no longer equally subject to the law. You're taking yourself out of the equation, and so the symmetry is destroyed. So that abolishes the entire legal constitution. The game is up. So for people to be authorized to resist, Kant goes on, there would have to be a public law permitting it to resist. That is. So he says, if this, like, let's imagine, he says, right? Let's imagine that things were otherwise. How could people be actually authorized with right, in the political sense, to resist? Well, there would have to be a public law, right? Because law defines right. So you'd have to have an extra law built into the law that says, well, when the law gets really bad, you get to resist. But Kant thinks this won't do. This is a disastrous idea. Why? Well, the highest legislation then would have to contain a provision that it is not the highest. And that makes people as subject by one and the same judgment sovereign over him to whom it is subject. This is a contradiction, right? Now the law would have to say, here I am, the law, the highest authority on what is right and wrong. But turns out that when you think things are really bad, you are the highest authority, because you get to decide at some point to resist. But now we have two highest authorities, right? We have the law being the highest, and you being the highest. Well, only one thing can be the highest. If you're subject to a person's decision about whether they have to obey, then their decision is the ultimate final decision. And so you are subject to it. You're lower in the ranking. If the people have to accept your judgment, the law's judgment, then you are the highest. It cannot be both, because that would mean that the people are subject to the law and the law is subject to the people, which is a circle. So he thinks this is self-contradictory, and the contradiction is evident as soon as one asks, who is to be the judge in this dispute between the people and the sovereign? Remember, if we have a dispute between you as an individual and the law, what we have is something that is exactly the thing we find in the state of nature all the time. We have two different points of view, two expressions, two judgments that are conflicting. And when we have two conflicting judgments, to leave the state of nature, what we need is an impartial judge over it. So who's going to be that judge? Well, you might think we built the state, but we already have the state. You're conflicting with the state, so we need a further judge. Maybe we set up a third higher judge. Okay, well, here Kant thinks you can start seeing the contradiction, right? Why is it a contradiction? Because let's say that you now have a dispute with this third higher judge. Now who's going to be judging? Because we have the same structure again, right? You have one interpretation. This third higher judge, which is supposed to judge between you and the state, who was supposed to be the judge in the first place. Now we have a state of nature situation, so we need a fourth judge. Okay, now you have a disagreement with the fourth judge. We need a fifth judge, and a sixth judge, and a seventh judge, and you can go on infinitely, right? You can never get out of this. The only way out of it is to just stop at a point and say, okay, we have a final judgment, and you have to stick with it, even if you don't like it. And if you're going to stop anywhere, you might as well stop at the first position, right? When you have the state the first time. So you should obey the law, because otherwise, in the last sentence here, it will be apparent that the people just wants to be the judge in his own suit. You just want to decide for yourself. Now you might want that, but that's of course the state of nature. And we've already seen that the state of nature is unacceptable. Okay. Let's summarize it in this way. And this is a way in which Kant thinks, or the Kantian argument should have some purchase on you if you buy into this social contract way of reasoning, or at least the Kantians think. So the following is accepted by almost everybody. This seems to be a obvious thing to say. The problem with the state of nature is that people must act on their private judgment. If you think that the state can be justified, at least in principle, then you probably believe that people just being their judges in their own case all the time, not a great idea. Locke thinks this, Hobbes thinks this, Kant thinks this. Most people think this. Well, if you think that, then you can see the worry about disobedience, right? Because if you're not subject to a common judge with others, then you're in a state of nature. at least with respect to those others. And 3, people who disobey the law refuse to recognize the state as their common judge. So it follows that people who disobey the law, they put themselves in a state of nature with respect to others. Now, that's all well and good, but suppose you also think, like Kant or for different reasons Hobbes, you also think that people who act on a private judgment, being the state of nature, is unacceptable. It could be for moral reasons, it could be for prudential reasons, but unacceptable either way. It then follows that disobeying the law is actually unacceptable, either morally or prudentially, maybe both. So it starts with this argument here, this problem of disobedience starts with an idea about what the issue in the state of nature is. And the key turning point is just like, how bad do you think the state of nature is? If you think it's really bad, then disobeying the law must become really, really problematic, and vice versa. Okay. Let me conclude with a couple of thoughts about social contract theory in general. The argument I just showed completes Kant's sort of the reflection on Kant's points about disobedience, why he says such extreme things as he says. I want to take a step back, since we've seen Hobbes, Locke, and Kant, we've seen 3 versions of the social contract that take different positions about what the social contract is, what the problem is that it's responding to, but also what the existence of a state means for this idea of disobedience. So first I want to separate these a little bit, these different types of arguments about social contract, and then get back to some questions or sort of macro points of view, including points about disobedience. So every social contract theory agrees that the starting point of our thinking is that people are free and equal, naturally speaking. This is why they start with state of nature theories. Right? If you remember weeks ago, it's what we started with too, talking about why should we start thinking about the state of nature. Well, you abstract the situation of government and the law away from our thinking, you see what we have left. What we have left is sort of the raw materials with which you can build the case for the state. That's the background against which you have to justify the introduction of the state. All social contract theories think that if you abstract away the state, if you think about a state of nature, then what we have left are people who are, in a moral sense, free and equal. Or in a brute empirical sense, maybe for Hobbes, free and equal, but free and equal nonetheless. And so the problem or the challenge becomes, when we want to justify the state, is how do we get the authority of a state consistent with this naturally free and equal condition of human beings. So, like I said before, all social contract theories offer basically the same answer. They do it in different forms. State authority is self-imposed. Kant even invokes the Latin lawyer's phrase, volenti non fit injuria. Roughly translated, the willing are not done any injustice. If you accept it, if you agree to it, it cannot wrong you. Okay, so we have at least two different versions of the social contract. Right? Like so in Locke, we have the social contract conceived of as an event. It's a moment when the state is actually formed through consent. So for Locke, how do we square this circle? How do we fit the authority together with people's natural freedom and equality? Well, self-imposed, of course, is the answer, as with all social contracts. But how self-imposed? Well, literally self-imposed, right? Imposed by your freely given consent. It can be done expressly or tacit, but it has to be freely given for Locke by each and every individual person separately. It cannot be given sort of in your stead, cannot be given by your parents, cannot be given or assumed just because you have a certain color, a certain passport, or whatever. It has to be given by you. Now, you can do it by vowing, by promising, that's expressly, or you can do it, Locke thinks, you can do it by just remaining within the territory. We've seen questions about whether that's good enough, given that Locke thinks it has to be freely given by you, but There's the answer. Now, if you think that, right, if you think that the social contract is this thing that actually happens, or must happen at least for the state to be legitimate, and that the thing that happens is consent, well, then the authority of the state requires that consent. If it requires that consent, and if the consent is not there, then disobedience becomes permissible. We've seen with Locke, there's a couple of ways this might be true, right? When you have an absolute government, it's quite clear that that was not what you consented to, because it would have been irrational for you to consent to it. When a foreign invader happens, that was not the one you consented to, so society is dissolved, and so on. The second version, the one that we see with Hobbes and Kant, is more a social contract not as an event, but as an idea. As Kant puts it, a rational idea. It's like a metaphor by which we can think through what the state has to be like in order to be justified, or the way we can think through why it is that the state is justified. Hobbes says, imagine that you could have this social contract. If you lived in the state of nature, it would be rational for you to accept, and therefore living in the state is rational for you to accept. It removes the worries, right? That's the justifying move. You might have a moral objection. Actually, no, says Hobbes, because there is no morality outside of the state. You might have a rational objection. This is a bad deal. Actually, no, says Hobbes. The state of nature is so terrible that this is a better deal. So, all objections gone, justification complete. Kant, we've just seen, also does not think that authority requires actual acceptance, as with Locke. No actual consent is required. You can be forced into the state. So the state simply is, or at least can be made, consistent with your freedom and equality. The state simply is, or can be made, self-imposed. And it does this by uniting the wills of all and enforcing it. But now we can start seeing why disobedience is such a problem for these views, right? If we are necessarily the authors of the law, if the law is necessarily self-imposed just by being the law, well, then it becomes quite inevitable that obedience is required. That's what it means for it to be necessary. All right, a couple of thoughts, macro thoughts, about the social contract as a general theory. What we've just seen with these two different approaches and their views on obedience is this. There's a kind of dilemma here. The more you ramp up the problem of the state of nature, remember here in the argument on this page, 1 through 4 is fairly widely shared. Locke thinks this is true. Hobbes thinks this is true. Kant thinks this is true. 5 is the turning point. Kant and Hobbes really ramp up the problem of the state of nature, either in prudential or in moral terms. But they think it is so bad as to be completely unacceptable. Locke, we've seen, thinks the state of nature is a much nicer, much more bearable place. It's not great. It's something you definitely want or should want to leave behind, but not at any cost. Alright, so here's your dilemma, right? The more you do what Hobbes and Kant are doing, the more you ramp up the problem of the state of nature, the easier it becomes to justify the state. All you need to do now, if you're Hobbes, is just to show that, well, state of nature is so terrible, as long as the state is non-terrible, and terrible meaning the absolute freaking worst, right? As long as the state is not that, then boom, you're done. So it becomes easier for a state to be justified. But at the same time, right, the harder it becomes to justify any disobedience. The problem being, of course, like if any alternative to life under the law is so horrible as to be unacceptable, well, then you stepping outside of the law just becomes unacceptable itself. The opposite seems true as well, right? Like the more you downplay the problem of disobedience, the more you poo-poo it. You've seen Locke poo-poos disobedience a little bit. He says, people worry about what I say, but they won't be that bad. People won't disobey just for any old reason. If things get really bad, they'll disobey anyway, etc., etc. If you downplay it enough, if you think, we can actually live with quite a lot of disobedience, Well, what you're saying in effect is we can live with quite a lot of state of nature around us. But if we can live with quite a lot of state of nature, then the task of justifying the state government becomes accordingly much more difficult. Because if it's bearable to be in a state of nature, well, now you have to show me that the state is a really, really good deal. And if the state of nature is a place in which morality is present, now you have to show me that it respects my moral status as a free and equal person, and so on. So the two seem to come together. And I think that's what we're seeing here with Hobbes and Locke. Well, Hobbes and Kant on the one hand, and Locke on the other. Now, remember this point that Kant makes in the quotes. Let me put it up again. Here, the final quote. Kant talks about why it's impossible for the law to allow people to resist it. You might think that something like that will solve the problem, but Kant is quite right, I think, to point out that, at least on his type of theory, that won't do. Right? You might want to say, okay, well, the state of nature is absolutely horrible, but still there could be the occasional disobedience because we are rationally committed to accepting the state, but only a limited state. The state of nature is unacceptable, morally speaking, the state is morally required, but only limited states, limited governments are morally required, not any old state. But that's a dangerous path to walk if you believe in this roughly Kantian or Hobbesian type of theory. If the state of nature is so unproblematic, if the state of nature is so deeply problematic, I should say, and you keep an eye on the fact that the state of nature consists of people being judges in their own case, well, the same problem appears, right? If only limited government is justified, or necessarily self-imposed, or rational, or something, then who gets to judge when the government really is limited? Who gets to judge when the government stays within its limits or oversteps its limits? If the answer is you get to judge, well, then you're back in a state of nature. Because in a state of nature, you get to judge. If the answer is the state gets to judge, well, then you just have to obey all the time, because then the state's judgment is, guess what? It stayed within its limits. And so you obey. More precisely, you might issue complaints, as Kant puts it, but you cannot resist. So you might petition, you might go to the courts, and maybe the state at times says, okay, we did overstep its limits, but its decision about that is final. If it says something else, that should go. So people sometimes try to spin this story. They say, yeah, the Kantian story about the state of nature is true. The state is morally required, but only a type of constitutional democracy is morally required. Not just any old state. And sure, you can say that as a matter of sort of pure reason or right, in the sense of sort of rational justice. But when we're talking about obeying the law, if the state of nature is morally unacceptable, and disobeying the law puts you in a state of nature, it follows quite straightforwardly that disobeying the law is morally unacceptable. So it's not clear, and this is a thing that Kant teaches us, it's not clear how you avoid this problem of disobedience being impermissible if you buy these sort of dour stories about the state of nature. Now, final point is the one I mentioned before when we talked about these Kant quotes already. You might think, well, okay, well, let's not solve the problem then with this about disobedience with the state overstepping its limits, the state becoming abusive, by saying that the individual gets to decide when or not the limits are reached, but we'll have some further judge, maybe a world government or something. It's okay, nice. Then the dispute between me and the state does not lead to a state of nature because there's a further government that we can go to. But then the problem raises again, like we said, what if I have a dispute with this further government? They say something that is really, really deeply unjust. They do something that's really, really deeply unjust. Now do I get to disobey? If yes, state of nature. If no, unlimited government. I was ending with two questions. These are worries, sort of general worries about how to make sense of these Hobbesian and Kantian theories, especially Kantian theory, actually. First is if you think of the social contract not as an event, but as an idea, then a problem raises about who the people are who are joining into the social contract. So Locke is a simple answer. Who are the people? It's the people who gave their consent. Done. Consent has to be actually given, and so you look at who actually gave it. Those are your people, and if you want to know where to draw the boundaries or the borders around the country, well, you look at who are the consenters, you draw the boundary around them. Kant, though, thinks something very differently. He says it's a rational idea, you're committed. Okay, well, if it's a rational idea, then we're all committed, but we don't all live in the same country. So how are we going to separate these? How are we going to settle the question of who's in and who's out? It's not clear at all that Kant has a good answer. Kant says something. He says the people who cannot avoid living side by side. It's basically the people you can't avoid bumping into each other. But, you know, when you go to Arizona, there is a little town called Nogales. And half of Nogales is on one side of the border, and the other side, that's in Nogales, Arizona. And then the other side of the border is Nogales, Sonora in Mexico. State borders are hardly drawn that way. And the Kantians aren't objecting. And it's not clear why the Kantians should object. Now that the state border is drawn this way, people in Sonora, Mexico have a very hard time living side by side with the people in Nogales, Arizona. Because there is a border in between them. So maybe you think on Kant's view, no problem. But then why draw the border there? Well, it would be wrong, for example, if the US would take its border and move it south by a couple of 100 miles. It's not clear that the Kantian can object. That's a deep problem, right? The social contract is supposed to be a metaphor or an actual explanation of why certain countries are justified in being governed the way they are. If that's a good story, then we need to know, for example, why certain countries are and other countries are not justified. Now, some things seem intuitively horribly unjustified. For example, some countries colonizing others. England goes around the world and starts colonizing about a third of the world, subjecting people, forcing them under its rule. If this really is unjustified, and you are a Kantian, there is a deep and important question about how do you explain this. It's not clear that you can explain this. And if you cannot explain it, it turns out that the theory has a real big cost attached to it, theoretical cost. It has some very counterintuitive results. That is something you should worry about. Okay, well, this is the end of the lecture. This is what we missed out on. I hope this helped. If things are unclear, we didn't have, of course, any chance to discuss or debate. I didn't have a chance to clarify things that I said that were unclear. If you do have any questions, please send me a message either through Canvas or through email, and I'll answer as soon as I can. Thank you.